How do you use preliminary data to improve your R01 score? That's what we are talking about today. If you're new around here, my name is Sarah Dobson. I'm a research grant consultant, and my team and I help early career researchers get funded at NIH. So we've been doing this whole series on preliminary data, and this is where we kind of bring it all together and talk about how preliminary data can be used to improve your score on your R01. And you can think about this either in terms of how you use your preliminary data strategically when you're submitting a new application, and also when you are resubmitting an application that either was not discussed or was discussed but not quite in the fundable range, right? So there are all sorts of different scenarios here that we can imagine, but the overall idea is that you are using your preliminary data to improve your score. So how do you actually do that? Well, again, it all comes down to the main functions of preliminary data in your R01 application. And of course, we've talked about this in our previous videos in this series. Preliminary data can be used either to speak to the feasibility of your project, or it can be used to speak to the overall scientific premise of your project. And ideally, in a well-written, competitive, persuasive R01 application, you're using it in both of those situations, right? You're speaking to the feasibility of your project with your preliminary data, and you're speaking to the scientific premise of your project. And to do that effectively, you need to understand where preliminary data fits in the application and how you can leverage it to improve your score. So let's start with the easier scenario, right? The one that most people can wrap their mind around a lot more easily, and that's speaking to feasibility. And that's really this idea of, look, we've done this before, we're familiar with these techniques, with this analysis, with the type of work that's being done, and we can very clearly demonstrate that we know what we're doing. It's not going to be a problem. We've done it before. This is feasible, right? And so typically you would see that in your approach section, and you would speak to the feasibility in your approach section by pointing to your previous work, right? So that's pretty straightforward. But when it comes to speaking to the scientific premise of your work, there are different ways to handle this. I personally generally recommend that you do most of this in your significance section, because that's where you're really building that argument for why the research needs to be done in the first place, right? And when it comes to preliminary data in your significance section, you are really using that to explain how you arrived at your central hypothesis or your main objective for your research project, right? You're kind of showing your work in terms of how you arrived there. And you are going to be doing that by speaking to your prior work, but also synthesizing what's already in the literature to build this argument around why the research needs to be done and what becomes possible when you fill this gap in knowledge, right? So preliminary data in this section is being used in a very different way. And that's to say, look, we've done sort of the initial work here, and we feel like we're really onto something. And so we want to continue this work and build upon it so that we can draw more robust conclusions, right? That's essentially the sort of general argument that you're trying to make. But you also want to make sure that your preliminary data is helping inform the development of each of your aims, right? So it's not just that overall scientific premise of your work, but you're also sort of demonstrating in the development of each of your aims how your prior work is informing what you're proposing to do in the future, right? And so that also involves speaking to your preliminary data in that sense and saying, here's how the work that we've already done is informing how we're designing aim 1, aim 2, aim 3, right? And so the more you're able to point to preliminary data in the development of each one of your aims, the more solid your project is going to feel, because you are, again, speaking to the scientific premise and the reason that aim 1 and aim 2 and potentially aim 3 need to happen, right? So that, in my view, is the sort of score driving function of preliminary data, more so, I think, than feasibility. Although, of course, feasibility is very important, and you really do need to reassure your reviewers that you know what you're doing. It's completely under control. But I think the more compelling case that you can make is why the research needs to be done by sort of demonstrating what you have done already that's leading you in this new direction that's really going to advance the field, right? And so that is where your preliminary data can be really sort of exciting and really help generate that enthusiasm that is necessary for those great scores that are going to get your project funded, right? Feasibility, it's necessary, of course, but it's not necessarily very exciting, right? And so when you can use preliminary data to sort of generate that excitement among your reviewers, that's where you see the great scores for your project, and that enthusiasm among your reviewers for the potential of your work to advance the field. And so in my view, that really happens on the sort of development of the scientific premise side rather than the feasibility side. So bottom line, of course, if you've been following along in this series, is that preliminary data is absolutely essential in your R01 application and in many other R series mechanisms as well, but particularly for the R01. And so knowing how to use it, knowing how to leverage it is crucial to your success. So if you found that helpful, I strongly encourage you to sign up for our free resource library. Inside the library, you'll find all sorts of tutorials and tips and worksheets to